every indie match now. Handshake, drawn out move exchange, this is awesome chant, strike exchange, dive, no sell indie strong style, dive, more strikes, no sells, dive, flippy floppy sequence, dive, hit everyone with each other's finishers, then Humpty Dumpty we all fall down. Fight forever chant, rinse and repeat until every move is useless and means nothing, dive, take unsafe shot that looks like shit and hurts like hell, then roll up finish. Handshake and hug after match, everyone's hand raised, all these guys chant, go home and type on social media thanking opponents and company for the match and telling others they should book these guys. Or so once tweeted Randy Orton, before he deleted it. But that did get me thinking, what is indie style wrestling? How can it be so popular and yet still so misunderstood? And if it's so popular, then why isn't it in the mainstream instead of being in the underground? And how exactly can it be so loved by so many who view it as true wrestling while others hate it and treat it like it's pretentious nonsense that damages the industry? Well, that's exactly what we're going to talk about, because today, Dave knows indie wrestling. The first and most obvious question is, how do you define indie style wrestling? Well, that's not exactly easy to do. While Mr. Orton's retracted statement does serve as one possible interpretation, it definitely doesn't speak for all of the independent style. Okay, so to make this easier, let's just begin with trying to examine indie style's history. With the NWA being the major leader in the business, being a non-alliance promotion was definitely an uphill climb. However, there were still those who dared to exist outside of the NWA's umbrella. These companies were known as outlaw territories. As such, they were the first to go against the grain and separate themselves from the world's most dominant wrestling force. Now, outside of these outlaws, there was also the possibility of a company within the NWA just leaving the alliance in order to do their own thing, like the WWE, which was formerly the WWF. So while the benefits of being under the NWA was very important to many promotions, there were still some that wanted to take their chances in order to make their own decisions and not be under the control of a major wrestling entity. Following that, the WWF would eventually become the major wrestling promotion itself. However, it would still continue to shape independent wrestling's future. In February of 1989, Vince McMahon stated before the New Jersey Athletic Commission that wrestling was predetermined. As a result of this, pro wrestling stopped being a regulated sport by many state athletic commissions. And without all these regulations, this meant that going forward, anyone could now become a professional wrestling promoter. And this is how the modern day independent wrestling scene in the United States came to be. So staying around the boom of the 1980s, Hulk Hogan was undoubtedly the biggest star in all of wrestling. His superhero theatrics and simplistic moveset resulted in a safe and easily accessible performance that was carried by mostly charisma and storytelling. However, there was naturally a pushback to this, where certain wrestling fans wanted to see something a little less cartoony. Now, the NWA, while not being as mainstream as the WWF was at the time, was still a very viable alternative where the focus was on more traditional styles of wrestling. So this meant that an independent promotion would either have to try and compete with the big boys by doing what they were doing, or, more wisely, they had to find something else that was completely different from both the WWF and the NWA. And throughout the years, as wrestling's major promotions changed, so did the independent scene. Jumping to today, there are many differences between what smaller promotions go through now as opposed to what they went through back during the territory days. One major development comes from the rise in wrestling schools in America. Many simply train specifically as wrestlers and then they begin to wrestle in independent promotions. It used to be a little more common for wrestlers to start from the ground up, setting up the ring, working as crew, refereeing matches, working as jobbers, and then eventually learning every single aspect of the business step by step before becoming a full-time regular wrestler. Now, there are pros and cons to this change. Some feel that it's better to get a more complete learning experience, covering all aspects of the business. Others think that it's great to be able to focus solely on ring work, therefore becoming all the wrestler you can be. And of course, this is just a generalization. There are plenty of wrestlers who learn both ways or with a variety of different methods. Speaking of wrestler variety, that's something else to consider. Some members of the indie roster don't necessarily fit the corporate model. For example, either not having the right body type or naturally being defiant towards real-life corporate authority figures. While some of these wrestlers may never get to the WWE, being different can still be a very powerful asset by making for some new perspectives. And being new and different is something that a lot of indie fans just love about indie indie wrestling. And some examples of that diversity is Extreme Wrestling. During the PG era of the WWE, companies like Combat Zone Wrestling can go to more adult places than the WWE. Another type of independent wrestling that is different than the mainstream is Chikara, which features some great comedy wrestling with wrestlers like The Colony. So you see, it's already difficult to narrow down independent wrestling to just one definition. But nevertheless, let's try to define indie style wrestling as best as possible. As a general overview, some current trends can be found in what is known as indie wrestling, at least as of right now. It usually features fast-paced matches with a lot of chain wrestling. Also, the complexity of move sequences can be very different from what you find in the majors. Also, indies are known to show off a lot of really unique and athletic maneuvers, which is pretty cool. Again, this does not speak for all independent wrestling, it's just an all-purpose overview. Also, bear in mind that what's considered independent today can very much be considered mainstream by tomorrow, which is perpetually happening even as we speak. With many Ring of Honor alum now being featured in the WWE, mainstream style is changing along with it. For example, the aforementioned dive from Randy Orton's tweet is definitely commonplace in the WWE right now, so you can already see how the line is beginning to blur. And on the subject of dives, independent wrestling has a reputation for using a lot of big moves that get pops from the crowd. Some have argued that using big moves and finishers as regular maneuvers waters them down and exposes the business for just how fake it truly is. Now, I won't go that far. For me, it's independent, so not many people are watching it to begin with. And those who are watching it are such wrestling nerds that they are beyond the casual effects that this practice might have on people anyway. So I really don't think the industry as a whole is too impacted by the independents that do this. Also, wrestling just tends to evolve in general. It's not just an indie phenomenon. For example, moves like the DDT used to devastate, and doing something like a DDT on the outside used to be damn near akin to attempted murder by kayfabe logic. And while the indies do get a lot of the blame, the mainstream is far from innocent. John Cena. And so yes, the independent scene does often take moves that used to end matches and turns them into the norm, but so does WWE. And on that note, the DDT is something that the independents have also begun to bring back as a legit finisher, which is a trend that has already begun resurfacing in NXT. So at least we know that the sword does cut both ways.
Arm drags, Northern Light suplexes, atomic drops. Oh, I just love how the indies are bringing sexy back.
Retro nutting out. Oh great, even wrestling has gone hipster.
Title card, you're back. Haven't seen you in a while. And it seems that you've multiplied and have gotten a voice. Okay, I must have accidentally got you wet and fed you after midnight. Alright, anyway, back to the lecture at hand. I'm not saying that I agree with any company watering down finishers and overusing big dangerous spots. I think finishers should be finishers and only one should be needed to end a match. I also don't need a whole lot of moves that are dangerous in real life in order to be entertained. But I also do like a more robust moveset that minimalizes things like boring rest holds and flat spots. In an ideal world for me, wrestling occupies a place that lays somewhere between these two extremes. This also leads to another criticism of the independent style. No selling. Some indie wrestling does have a tendency towards no selling moves. However, there is a whole plethora of indie wrestlers who have sold much better than most of the WWE. For example, Sami Zayn, dating back to his time as El Generico, was always one of the best salesmen in all of wrestling. And he still is. Although, that does go back to the whole indie going mainstream thing again. Part of the illusion that wrestling has is that moves should look more painful than they really are. Wrestlers like the Young Bucks have a somewhat opposite mentality, doing moves that are actually painful, but continuing to wrestle anyway like it didn't even hurt. Sure, when you see young spry wrestlers do this, it does prove that they're tough. But, as many veterans will point out, it also proves that they have a lot to learn about wrestling's long-term effects. And it also seems to neglect some of wrestling's most fundamental principles. Now with that being said, independent wrestling can be a much younger and hungrier group. Young people with something to prove tend to do things a certain way in all walks of life. They go out taking hard hits and showing off feats of athleticism and risking life and limb just to get noticed, which can be pretty great as long as it's incorporated with some solid, fundamental, time-tested wrestling practices. Because when it's done right, it is truly amazing. It's impressive to see high spots, quick exchanges, and more exciting moves brought together in an in-ring story. Which brings me to my next point. Storytelling. Well, there are definitely some in the independents that sometimes seem to forget that a story should be told, and that pro wrestling is, when all is said and done, a simulation of combat. the same wrestlers instead treat wrestling like an excuse to show off what athletic moves they can do. On the other hand, when done by the right wrestlers, independent wrestling can be even better than the majors, even when it comes to storytelling, which is something that the WWE is often praised for over the independents. For example, whenever you see a WWE match, it's usually pretty clear instantaneously who's dominating and who's getting the worst of it, right at that moment. Also, when that power shifts, you can tell right away what happened to cause the change. Oh, he missed a turnbuckle, or oh, he reversed his finisher. But some have called this style of storytelling very juvenile and very simplistic. Good indie wrestlers are capable of telling a more complex story. That kind of story complexity is what gets crowds going, and for good reason. And that is actually my final point. In many independents, there are no commentators, so someone other than the wrestlers need to drive the story forward. And with a smaller and more intimate crowd, the audience gets to influence the action a bit more. The wrestlers can actually hear the crowd clearly, sometimes even specific individuals in smaller venues. So while in ring, the wrestlers can actually adjust and interact with what the crowd wants more than they ever could in the majors. If they know something's working, they can go for that even more. There's also more opportunities for fan service and much less interference from corporate, which, as far as I'm concerned, is a good thing. In closing, I will be the first to admit that indie wrestling can be, at times, a bit problematic. But I will also be the first to say that at its very best, independent wrestling being done by more eager talent, more diverse talent, and in a more personal way can achieve things that the mainstream could never even dream of. But what do you think? Tell me what your thoughts are on independent wrestling down in the comments. And don't forget to give this video a big thumbs up, as well as giving me support over on Patreon. Thank you so much for watching. This has been Dave Knows.